what is the Mishnah for those who don't know? I grew up studying the Mishnah, but I think most people have no idea what the Mishnah is. So tell us what it is and why they should care about it.
So the Mishnah is the beginning of the so-called oral law being written down in Judaism. Not including like the Dead Sea Scrolls and Joseph, in Rabbinic Judaism. It's the beginning of Rabbinic Judaism, at least being written down. And it was about the year 200. So that it was kind of
AD, right? 200
yeah,
CE.
Yeah, and it was put together by someone named Yehuda Hanassi, Judah the Patriarch. But there were other Mishnayot also. It's a little complicated because there were other versions. But what he basically did was take the 5 books of Moses, which talk about different laws in different places, and kind of organize them by different topics. So, for example, there's an entire book on the laws of divorce. And you might be scratching your head and saying, well, wait a minute. There's only like 1 or 2 verses about divorce in the Bible, in Deuteronomy. How do you have a whole book? And so what the Mishnah is, it's the biblical text, but it's also the rabbinic interpretations and laws that come along with it. So it's basically the great rabbinic law book of the year 200.
Okay. And it compiles things from previous centuries, right? Not everything is from the year 200, right? It wasn't just invented out of whole cloth in the year 200. What they did, I think, is they took down traditions from previous centuries, and and what Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi did is codified them into a running text, essentially. Or maybe he took earlier texts, as you said as well, but he codified them into the current form.
Right. One of the things that the Mishnah is really good at is it has this idea that there's no such thing as a biblical contradiction. There's no such thing as a biblical contradiction. And with that concept in mind, the Mishnah will kind of tackle lots of really difficult issues of biblical texts in order to make everything really neat and nice.
Well, and I've talked about this on my program before, that there are in the Bible, in the Tanakh, things that are might be called apparent contradictions. And I want to share a quick story here. I was listening on the news the other night and I was watching a talk show, and they had this guy on, a Jewish guy, a secular guy, but he was Jewish. And he was talking about why is it that certain religions get so offended when you talk about their religion, and I won't say which religion we're talking about, but he says, look, this is what scholars of religion have been doing for centuries, is they take the contradictions, they show you what that contradiction is, and they talk about it and they deal with it. And I was thinking, that's such a Jewish perspective, right? He's a secular Jew and he has no idea. That's not what they do in other religions. But what you study from a very young age in Judaism is, what are the contradictions in the Bible? So later on, you don't get surprised by somebody who blindsides you. And then what the rabbis will do is they'll say, this is the contradiction, and here are 14 ways of solving the contradiction. Right. That's like what a Barbanel does in his commentary every week on the Torah portion. He gives you a list of 40 questions, and his questions are often more interesting than his answers, because his answers aren't always so convincing. But emphasis, and this is what we learned when we studied Rashi as a kid, is what's bothering Rashi. What's bothering Rashi, the reason he's telling you some statement, is because there's some apparent contradiction he's wrestling with, and he's giving you an answer. And it should be so obvious to you what the problem is that he just spoon feeds you the answer. Well, now after 1,000 years or 800 years later after Rashi, we've got to ask ourselves, what was the problem here? He was smarter than some of us. And once you get used to it, you immediately pick up on these contradictions. So the Mishnah solves contradictions.
In a certain way, and after the Mishnah started this trend or reflected it, in Judaism, as time would go on, it'll almost be a positive thing to have a contradiction, because you have a problem, you get to a higher understanding, like a new answer.
So what you do in Judaism is you'll come to the rabbi and you'll bring up a contradiction no one ever thought of. And that's a chiddush. It's this innovation. It's a beautiful thing. It's not get out of here. Which in some religions, if you bring
get out of here.
No, in some religions you bring a contradiction in the Bible, and you're kicked out of church. You're stoned out of the mosque or whatever. And in Judaism, it's like no. We want to know what's in the biblical text, and we want to. And if there's apparent contradictions, we want to solve them. We want to know about this.
Right. So let me just give an example.
Please.
In Deuteronomy 15:19, it says, "You shall consecrate to the Lord your God all male firstborns that are born in your herd and in your flock." Okay? So you should takdish, you should consecrate them. Okay. However, in Leviticus 27:26, we have the exact opposite. It says a firstling of animals, however, which as a firstling is the Lord's. It cannot be consecrated by any man.
Okay.
Okay. So you can't give it over as the offering, or you can. What are you supposed to do? And so
how does the Mishnah solve that? Yeah. Actually, before you get to the Mishnah, so you studied in a university, and it was an Orthodox university, but I'm assuming you studied what's called biblical criticism. That is, it's a secular approach that says Moses didn't write the Torah, and if there's contradictions, we don't want to solve those contradictions. We want to emphasize them. So what would be the biblical higher criticism it's called, right? I've talked about textual criticism, which is something different. But what would be the approach of a so-called higher critic of how they would deal with this problem?
The higher critical approach would be that there were two different sources, and that's why you have two different contradictions.
And they actually contradict each other.
Right.
So Leviticus was written by the P source, and Deuteronomy was written by the D sourse, and they lived in different centuries in different places and in different interests.
Right.
And they're not only seeming to contradict each other. Deuteronomy may have even, depending on your view, right? Deuteronomy may have even read P and said, I want to give the opposite opinion, or vice versa, right? All right, so that's the higher critical approach. How does the Mishnah solve it?
Right, so the Mishnah says in Arachin 8:7, it says, and I'll have it here for you. So therefore resolve it as follows, okay?
And the words resolve it, those are in the Mishnah.
And before we even get to the answer, it's in the Mishnah, it also says here that, you can't say that it's one or the other. It has to be resolved. Okay. You can't say, it's impossible to say one because it contradicts the other. It's impossible to say this one. So the answer is no. You may sanctify it by consecrating its value to the owner, but you may not sanctify it by consecrating it to the altar. So it's kind of this mid-level. So you're consecrating the money. You're giving the temple the money, but you're not giving the temple the actual animal. Okay? So in this way, it's kind of maneuvering these very difficult passages, and it's coming along, and it's getting into what will later become a hallmark of not only Jewish, but a lot of people's interpretations of the Bible, that there are no contradictions whatsoever.
Right, and the idea there is that this is the word of God. God wouldn't contradict himself, and therefore it has a coherent message. Even though it appears to us incoherent or contradictory, there's a way of resolving this. Yeah, if I was reading this and I wasn't trying to think as a rabbi, what I would say in Leviticus, what it means is it already belongs to God, and therefore you can't sanctify it because it already belongs to God. And Deuteronomy is saying, sanctify it, give it over to God because it's his. And therefore, it's not that it's a contradiction. It's using the word sanctify in sort of a different connotation.
Exactly.
And then the context might be important too, because Leviticus really is a lot of it, not all of it, like Leviticus 19, obviously not. But a lot of things in Leviticus are laws for priests, and especially Leviticus 27. This is very technical information that the average person wouldn't be interested in. Whereas Deuteronomy 15:9 is Moses' speech, the way it's presented is Moses' speech before he dies, and it is for the layman. And it was read publicly.
And, you're right. And this is more important to the Hebrew readers, because in one passage it says takdish, you shall consecrate, and in the other passage it says lo takdish. So, these are so clear differences.
So it appears to directly be not almost. It's verb. If you take it verbatim, the way it's worded, it's a contradiction. A direct contradiction. Okay.
Exactly. And what I was going to point out to you in the Hebrew, because you wanted to
read me the Hebrew of the Mishnah. Yeah.
So Rabbi Yishmael says, Katuv echad omer takdish. One verse says that you shall consecrate. V'katuv echad omer al takdish. And one says that you should not consecrate. And here's the main line. Efshar lomar takdish. You can't say to consecrate it. Shekvar ne'amar al takdish. Because it already says don't consecrate it. The Efshar lomar al takdish. And you can't say don't consecrate it. Shekvar ne'amar takdish. So the answer is going to be about the money. So this is the main is this one little Mishnah here, even though there's so many dozens of others we could have picked, is the main interpretive method is that everything needs to work together. Okay? So with that, let's move to another interpretive method. And this is called omni-significance. It's a great word. You can use it for anything, but it's really great for rabbinic texts. It's that every little bit is significant. Not just a book of the Bible, not just a chapter, not just a verse, not just a word, even not just a letter, even a dot.
I love what you're bringing here. So this is probably the central, most important thing in understanding rabbinical Judaism is what you're about to share. Okay, go.
Right. So, for example, on the Passover, in Numbers 9, 10 to 11, it tells the story of the second Passover. If somebody who's not able to make the first Passover, they're able to have a second Passover exactly 1 month later. And the Hebrew, what it says is that if a person is b'derech rechoka, on a distant path, he's out of town, what we would say, they're out of town, right? So that person is the one who could bring the sacrifice a month later. So the rabbis in the Mishnah, they say, did you notice in the Torah scroll there's a little dot on the hay in that word derech rechoka? In the last letter has a dot, which is superfluous. And so the rabbis are trying to figure out what is a
So this is really land? Important, guys. There are 10 places in the Torah, 15 in the Tanakh, where there are dots, which are not vowels, they're not accents, they're dots that actually appear. They're supposed to appear in a Torah scroll as well. And the Torah scroll doesn't have accents and vowels. And so these are 15 places that are permanently marked with dots. And what do they mean? Okay, so
in the Mishnah, in Pesachim, which is the Passover Mishnah, chapter 9, Mishnah 2, the rabbis are trying to figure out, well, how far is a far journey? How far away do you have to be to bring a second to get off? It's basically like saying, instead of celebrating the America on July 4th, we'll do it on August 4th. So where or absentee voting, something like that. It's like, who qualifies to push the Passover for a month? How far do you have to be? Do you have to be 10 miles, 100 miles, 1,000? So the first opinion is, no, you need to be already at Modin, which is at least a day's journey.
Okay.
So the second opinion is, no, even if you're 1 foot outside of the temple, the minute you step out of the temple, you're not in the temple mindset. You could be considered far away. And that's what the little dot is teaching you.
Okay, and so what the rabbis are doing here is so it's very interesting. You mentioned here now 2 rabbinical methodologies. The first is there are apparent contradictions. The rabbis want to solve those contradictions. I completely accept that from my personal Bible perspective. The second one, this idea of reading meaning into every small characteristic of the biblical text, even if it doesn't have linguistic meaning, this omnisignificance, that's a part I don't personally adhere to or agree with, ascribe to. But it's actually important because the reason our biblical text was preserved with such precision is because of this idea of rabbinical omnisignificance. For example, or you could give the example maybe, Rabbi Akiva famously would read meaning into every letter and every word to the point where other rabbis mocked him about it.
Right, the crowns.
The crowns in the letters even. So every characteristic of every letter was preserved, or it was attempted to be preserved with complete precision, because the rabbis believed every letter had significance. You could change a law based on if a word was written with an extra vav or not an extra vav, which doesn't change the meaning. But the rabbis would read meaning. They would say, why is it there if it doesn't change the meaning? It must have some hidden significance that we can read into the text.